Tonight I'm talking with John Wheeler, who's the author of The Light Behind Consciousness and many other books on non-dual spirituality, and was the man I call my final teacher. And what do you think about just kind of a review of the basics? That's I think always useful, is kind of to get down to, well, what's really at the heart of the matter of resolving the search for wholeness, happiness, peace, and all that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and it's really the theme, that I stress quite a bit, when I'm talking with people, and I have a meeting that I do, and when people come, I'm basically constantly going back to precisely that, and so I actually think it's the most important point to grasp, and that is, what is the essence that's, that we're trying to communicate around non-duality. And because I find that there are a lot of topics, there's a lot of issues, and a lot of things that people discuss, and sometimes the number of those issues or the complexity of the issues is such that we can lose sight of the basic point of why we're looking at this spirituality in the first place. So getting back to basics, I think, is important.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes the way that I would approach this is to talk about, looking at spirituality, looking across, some of the great traditions, and really having a look and noticing that when you look closely at what's being communicated, there's a kind of a common essential theme, whether it's Buddhism or Hinduism or, various types of spirituality. And, typically what you find is that when they get to the essence of their communication, their main point, all across the board, they often refer to that as non-duality.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's important then to look and see and try to understand what exactly it is that they're talking about. And the way that I see this is that all of these approaches that have been looking very deeply into these topics all talk about a core reality, a fundamental, essential nature of things that is essentially what they're pointing to, and they give it various names, and they try to point to it in many different ways, but they do essentially agree, and they talk about this unique, singular sense of reality that is the essence of it. And, so they will give it various names, like I'm sure we've heard, consciousness or being or spirit or emptiness or, all these different things. And clearly all of these labels are just pointers. And, it's not, the important thing is not necessarily the label itself, but it's just the recognition that something is being pointed to, and we're being encouraged to recognize that, to understand that. And so that's I think the common thread in all of these approaches of non-duality. And the other piece of the puzzle is when they talk about what that is or where we should find that, they also come up with a very common, message, and that is that reality and your identity are one and the same thing. And, that's really one of the main areas where the word non-duality really even comes into the discussion, because, they're saying there's no separation between this final reality and your nature. So they're telling us that if we want to discover that reality, to recognize that the place that we should look for that is right where we are, right, look right into the essence of our own being, our own nature, that's where we will discover this. And so that brings it into the immediacy of something very practical, something in our experience, something that we can grasp or kind of recognize. And I think the third piece was a little tip that Sailor Bob Adamson gave, which was very helpful. And he mentioned that whatever you are is already present. You know beyond any doubt that whatever you are is here. There's no doubt about the fact of your presence or your existence. So that nature, whatever it is, we know intuitively and beyond any doubt to be here now, because we simply have no doubt whatsoever about the fact of our own existence.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're really looking at. And practically speaking here, when we're going to say, well, how do we really approach this? What we're really doing is we're actually just having a look to see what our own being, our own existence here in this moment actually is. And at that point, we're going on direct recognition, looking for ourselves, and seeing what we can see. And I think that's the practical application of these things. It's once we get kind of oriented to that, then we're actually going to say, okay, what am I? I know that I am. I know that I'm here. I know there's no doubt about my own presence, my own existence. Let me look at that and see what I can see about that. And that is the practical realization or the practical experience of what non-duality is communicating. And that's how I see it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, we've all heard some would say, well, who is going to do this looking? Who is going to see what's here right now? Who indeed is going to see? If there is no one, then who's going to do that? And doesn't the looking simply reinforce the idea of a false person that can somehow discover its own absence? What would you say to that?
Well, what you see when people start to go to those positions is they're kind of jumping the gun. They're, how would you say, they're quoting various things that they've heard, maybe in books or on the internet or something like that, and they're kind of jumping away to these kind of theoretical issues, these kind of rebuttals. And at that moment, actually, they've kind of moved away from the looking, from the investigation, from the following, kind of in the direction of the pointers, So again, just to kind of step back for a second, there's this, basic communication of a fundamental reality and a stressing on the importance of understanding that, recognizing that, a pointer to the fact that that is what you are, and an encouragement to basically ask ourselves, is that clear? Do I understand? Do I recognize what's being pointed to? And in a kind of an application of that, is there's just simply a looking, just follows that pointer that just basically looks and says, oh, what can I see about that? And what you find is that that seeing is very available. It's extremely direct. There's nothing tricky or hard about it at all, because again, we're talking about something, a fact of experience that's entirely present and entirely kind of doubtless. And so what I find is a lot of those kind of questions, or a lot of those comments that kind of come in, are mostly coming out of a theoretical or kind of conceptual perspective.
Right.
And essentially what it's doing is it blocks the looking, it blocks the natural understanding of what this is, and it's because the mind at that point is kind of hijacking the discussion. Well, I can't do that because of this, or so and so says this, or here's some reason why it won't work. All of these things are extremely conceptual, and anybody that's actually looked in this way and basically follow the points, I'm sure that that they can vouch for the fact that it's quite workable, very simple, and kind of there's nothing problematic whatsoever about it. So I would rather encourage sticking with the looking and just getting the core issue resolved and understanding what's being pointed to, instead of coming up with all kinds of what ifs and buts and I can't do it and all these reasons.
All right. Or justifications for not looking, but rather just staying in the concepts, yes?
Because the truth of it is, one of the things, so what we were talking about is often what I call like the positive side. In other words, what is the actual factual truth of what reality is, and what is your being, kind of in relation to that. What is the truth? What is the true nature of things? And so that's the heart, of non-dual spirituality. Now, the flip side of that is, when they start talking about what's the source of our suffering or our questions or our problems in life, they talk about how, the not being clear on that, being mistaken on who we are, having a false identity, living under some unexamined notion, and I'm sure we've all heard that, but they talk about the concept that I'm something separate, that I'm something limited, that I'm somehow an isolated self or person, and that concept being at the root of our trouble. And what happens when we actually look in this way is that we find that concept is not true, because your being is not a separate, isolated, person at all. And so the seeing or the looking at this kind of contradicts and overcomes the unexamined notion. And what is that recognition is that I, or that separation, or that entity is only conceptual, that's not the reality of things. And that's the kind of the flip side of the same recognition, like the truth of what I am and the seeing through and relinquishing of the erroneous concept of what I am not. And they're really the same kind of activity, they're the same understanding, but they're basically kind of approaching it from two ends, of the spectrum. And when I look in this way and I realize that separate I or that entity is an illusion or is a concept, it brings a tremendous freedom, it brings a tremendous experience of the resolving of the separation. And so this proves why, really, when people say things like out of the gate without the investigation, like, well, there's nobody here to do that, or I can't do that because there is no I, or something like that. What you find, it's like an assertion of a conclusion that often is actually not recognized experientially. Because, if someone were actually to say, there is no I here, that is the understanding.
Yeah.
That's the full understanding. And in that is tremendous freedom, the resolution of seeking, the resolution of suffering, the resolution of doubt. And so, you can often tell kind of in practice where someone's coming from, because if they claim that there's no I, and yet they talk about seeking, suffering, and the doubts and all that kind of thing, it means that it's just a concept. It's just a pointer that someone has picked up, and they're basically kind of asserting it without recognizing.
Kind of almost like an unintended hypocrisy in it, isn't there?
Yeah, and it's asserting the conclusion, but not really understanding or experiencing the meaning of it. And what'll happen is we'll say something like, well, there's no I here, I can't do anything. okay, to say something like that, because that's something that we've kind of heard. But then we'll say, we'll turn right back around and say, but when am I going to be free? Or, when am I going to get the understanding? Or when is the so-called final understanding going to happen for me? And if you look at that very closely, you can see that the I thought, or the separate person thought, is actually still being fully believed. It's 100% invested in. So you can't, so if you do want to make a statement like there is no I, or there is no separation, then, it's important that, that's a genuine and very, solid experiential statement, not just something that we have picked up. And
not some theory that you've adopted, right?
Yeah. So I would say, in practice, and just talking about this in a kind of a normal way, is there's not much gain in asserting some end game or some kind of conclusion as a concept. There's no particular benefit. In fact, what it actually does is it stalls and blocks the direct recognition of what this is all about. So it's, I think as you said occasionally in some of your writings, it's kind of a booby prize.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I've got the answer, I can say the answer, I've got the non-dual quote, but
then you wonder why the heck you're still suffering.
Yeah, but I might still, be laboring under a misunderstanding of what reality is, and find myself seeking and suffering and having, these problems, and then basically saying, well, I wonder what's going on. And then the mind will start concocting all of these kind of things like, maybe there's a final understanding that will happen to me someday, or maybe the shift hasn't happened for me, or so-and-so got it and I don't have it, and all these things which are absolutely conceptual and have nothing to do with the basics of this. And in all of that conceptualizing, you may notice that what we've done is we've moved away from the basics.
Mm-hmm.
We've somewhere along the line dropped a kind of a recognition of the whole reason that we were looking at this in the first place. And
yeah, indeed, right.
That's why the stressing of the basics, as you were saying, and I talk about, is it's very, very important. The basics are very simple. They're not particularly, complex, and there is a kind of a tendency to overlook them or to discount them. So it's good that we stress them.
Yeah. Another thing I hear from time to time is, well, there's this felt sense of contraction or a felt sense of separation. There's no thought there that says I'm separate, but there is this kind of an emotional contraction or feeling of it, and sometimes it's hard to hear, at least I've noticed when I talk to people about this, that it seems like it's hard for them to hear that the basis of that is a thought, is a belief or an assumption which consists only in language or in words or thoughts. And I wonder if you could say a little about that.
Yeah, well, one thing that you see with this is that appearances, just as appearances, are never a problem. In other words, we perceive things, objects, we have experiences, we perceive a body, we perceive emotions, thoughts, all these things. They've never been a problem. They've never been any kind of a bondage or any kind of a limitation at any moment. And because, everybody, whether they understand this or don't understand this, they're experiencing all of these things, just like everybody else. And when you start to look at, well, what is creating the sense of limitation, in our experiencing, it turns out to be the concepts or the views by which we're interpreting the experience.
Mm-hmm.
So, let's say, we're perceiving a body, for example, doing certain things, feeling certain things, and without the label, without the judgment, without the interpretation, it can't possibly be a problem, So we thought but if the mind puts a label onto it, like this should be a certain way, or these set of feelings are good, those sets of feelings are bad, or I don't like this experience, or however it might be, that's when the feeling of limitation starts to come in, and you can't really have any suffering. You can't really have a problem without that conceptualizing process. So, even if there were some kind of contraction or some kind of energy in the body, how is it even a problem unless it's labeled as something wrong, for example? I mean, even to call it a contraction is already bringing in the labeling and bringing in the conceptualizing.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise it's just an energy, it's just a pattern that has a beginning and has an end like everything else. And so, when people talk about somehow the suffering or the limitation is there independent of the concept or independent of the labeling, I actually find that, as I've looked at this, that it's simply not true. It's a kind of a lack of perception of what's going on because we haven't really examined it closely. And, and these thoughts and concepts and views, they do generate feelings, just like feelings and experiences can generate thoughts. And so, in a way, they're kind of reinforcing of each other. But I guess, it's very, very important in this whole kind of thing to realize that, without the concept, without the interpretation, without the label put on any experience, you can't even judge it as a problem. I'd have to say, I have to say something like, for example, I have a contraction in my body, and that's not ideal. Or, that says something about me, or that's not, that shouldn't be here. Or, if I were spiritual, I wouldn't have that. And each and every one of those statements is only a conceptual interpretation. And again, without that, what do you have? You have an experience arising and setting in, what we come to see as our natural being, and in all of those experiences, you haven't lost your fundamental nature, and, nothing has altered with the deep or essential truth of things. And that's why, that first part that we were starting to explore about what are you actually,
mm-hmm.
is so important. And because, without a sense of that, without a sense of knowing the truth of what I am, I'm going to be completely, divorced from that recognition of what's real. Because again, these traditions have told us that fundamental reality of things is what you are. And so if we leave that out of the equation, if we overlook that basic point, and I consider that the fundamental basic point,
mm-hmm.
then we're just kind of left with a flow of experiences that we don't understand in relation to what reality is, and we're left with the mind labeling and judging and conceptualizing, putting all of these interpretations on them, and all of those things bringing in a kind of an artificial limitation. And so that's why it's experienced as suffering. It's experienced as a kind of a bondage or a kind of a limitation on reality.
Yeah.
And there's not much of a solution because, at that stage, without really clarifying the basics, what we're doing at that point is we're searching in the appearance while retaining the concepts for some kind of solution by, seeking an experience or trying to alter or modify the appearance or trying to, quiet the mind or, trying to work with the mind, trying to do all kinds of things to try to, kind of sort through this to find a kind of a core sense of peace or a sense of reality in things. And it just, if you pursued that for any length of time, like many of us have done, there's just simply no solution forthcoming in that perspective. So that's why it's just imperative that, if we want to get to the bottom of things and get a handle on this and really get a sense of something true, something real, something fundamental, that we have to look in terms of the basic points of who am I, what is my nature, and, who is it that I'm taking myself to be? Because, what it turns out in the end is that the view that we have of ourselves becomes the lens or the filter, through which we experience everything else. And, we experience the world, we experience spirituality, we experience relationships, we experience the body, the feelings, all of these things, they're really viewed in relation to the idea that we have of ourself. And that's why, that's another reason why that clarification of who we are becomes so important, because the entire view of life is always in relation to whatever view that we have. And
so instead of trying to search around in the appearance for the source, you start from the knowing of the source itself, is what I hear you say.
Yeah, exactly. So, why not start with if we look at it this way a little bit, I think it does become, it's fairly clear and straightforward. Oh, I can see now that, everything is a reflection of how I view myself, and, it should be self-evident that the place to start is to have a look and make sure that what I am or what I understand myself to be.
What is the self? Yeah,
is clear, because again, these traditions and the people that have looked into this, they're kind of saying how that mistaken identity is the root of all suffering. And, that's like, for example, in the Buddhist teaching, he said it very clearly, that the suffering, meaning all the limitation that people, that sentient beings experience, is all a result of this erroneous ego concept. The ego meaning the false sense of identity. And, and the path and the approach, the whole investigation, was to examine the truth of that assumption. Now, Buddha didn't say, as far as I'm aware, there's nothing to do, there's nothing to get, don't look at this.
No.
In his way, and other teachers, in that style, they would point and say, this is the nature of what is, look at this, see what's real. And people would have a look and find themselves stepping out of the artificial limitation. And not by denying that or just conceptualizing something that they read, but saying, this is an important thing to look at, because, the experience of life is in direct proportion to how we understand this.
Yeah, and without that initial firm understanding, and I like the way Mr. Gadada used the word that understanding is all. Without that initial pure conviction, not with a knower, but a sense of the knowing of that, then you can chase around in the vicious circle of the mind and experience, reinforcing the experience, reinforcing the concept continually reinforcing the experience, and it's a vicious circle. And there's certainly no joy in that, and certainly no freedom in that, is there?
Yeah, and I've done, in my life, a lot of things in years past. A lot of I would launch off on various pursuits of meditation and spiritual practice, and going here, going there, and all kinds of things. Under with the hope or the idea that maybe this will bring a solution. Maybe this will lead to a deeper sense of peace or clarity or something like that. But what I've found later, as this became more clear is that often I was bringing into those activities still that unexamined sense of self. And so, a lot of people in spirituality are pursuing things that they hear about, like enlightenment or something, or awakening, or whatever it is, whatever the popular concept is. And these things are all purely conceptual, really, because, they're conceived of as some, special experience that I don't have, and they're kind of conceived of as something that occurs to me as an event, in the future as a result of doing this and kind of doing that. So, and all of those things, we should already be able to see from what we're talking about are almost entirely in contradiction to the non-duality view, which is that your being already is that reality. So if we hear that message and really take that in and really consider what that means, and we just even reflect on that, we certainly are not going to be out running around trying to find some state or something in the future or something that we don't have, because all of those activities they're the complete opposite. So of the fact that what is being pointed to is already here. And so now we can, though, actually follow or apply that pointer by saying and looking, well, what is it that is here? What is it that I actually am? Because if the non-dual pointer pointers are saying that this reality is the essence of things, it's what you are. Have a look and see that and be clear on what that is. See, there is actually an implied encouragement to do that looking.
Yes.
They are not saying don't look, don't examine this. There's nobody here to examine anything. All these things are subtle misinterpretations of that. They're saying there is something here. You are that. Being clear on that does resolve the problem, and have a look. Otherwise, why would the teachers like Nisargadatta, encourage people to understand? Or, Ramana Maharshi says, ask who am I? These people with these, that are, people recognize as living in that understanding and being able to talk about that. They weren't, the funny thing is, they weren't saying, there's nobody here, nothing to do, nothing to get, that's the solution.
Not at all.
But a lot of people that are talking about this seem to have this idea that is the pointer, or that is what people were basically saying, and it's actually not.
Yeah.
I went to see Sailor Bob a few years ago. He said, "Have a look and see what you are."
Yes.
Do you know what you are? Have you seen your true nature? And do you know what the root of suffering is? These are very active questions, and they're not just put out there just to talk. They're put out there with kind of an encouragement to answer them.
Yeah.
Because I guarantee anyone that if we don't know what our nature is, and we don't understand what is at the root of suffering, and we are living under, kind of mistaken concepts without knowing that there absolutely will be a sense of seeking, suffering, and doubt, and a sense of limitation in life. No matter what we think, or no matter what we've read, or no matter what non-duality concepts we may be able to talk about.
Yes, I remember in my case having read all the books and some of them many times, and yet never understanding what they were saying.
Yeah, and I've done the same thing in my life. But at some point, it really it became recognized that, wow, I really need to have a look and really see. see what is being pointed to, and
to take it out of the domain of the mind, out of the domain of comprehending concepts and comparing concepts and making an assertion. Oh, okay, now I see what I am because I can conceptually assert that. I think that's the cul-de-sac that a lot of us fell into until there was a more direct, wait a minute, take a look at this. Do you see this?
Yeah, and I kind of look at it using that metaphor of the menu and the meal.
Mm-hmm.
The menu is a description of something, and it's pointers and words and all that, and that's kind of like the spiritual teachings or the pointers or something like that. And then there's the actual food, there's the actual substance that nourishes you, and that is what the menu is pointing to. And we don't want to become experts in reciting the menu and being able to list all the menus and kind of being an expert on all of the verbiage and all that, but somehow never tasted the meal itself. I mean, that's kind of a foolish position. I can say, I know everything about food. I know everything about how it's ever been described. And not just by one restaurant, but by I've studied 10 or 15 different approaches. I can go up and down and kind of describe all these things. But then somebody says, "Yeah, but have you ever actually tasted the food?" And then, well, oops, I never got around to that part of it. I've become an expert in talking about it, but I've never actually kind of consumed the actual nourishing food itself. And it's a very similar thing in spirituality. We can say, I've been to all the teachers, I've studied Vedanta, I've studied Buddhism, I know exactly what they talk about. I can argue it, I can dissect it and all that, but somebody can come along and say, yeah, but do you experience that peace or that freedom? Is that sense of seeking, is that sense of limitation, is that something that is your experience? And people will often kind of realize that that's not really hasn't been addressed yet.
Right, exactly.
And if that's not the case, then what's the purpose of it all? I mean, to spend years going to satsangs and talking about non-duality and all that stuff, and then at the end of the day, I don't know who I am, and I don't know what my nature is, and I'm finding that these suffering and limiting concepts are still my daily experience. I mean, it would lend one to think or to kind of pause, is that why was I doing all of that?
Mm-hmm.
And what was the purpose of all that activity? And that's why, again, the basics, the very, very universal message in all of these approaches is that the purpose of this is to be free.
Yes.
The purpose of this is to be beyond the seeking, to be beyond the suffering, to experience life outside of these limiting views which have been determining our experience. And if somehow, in the course of all the spirituality, that somehow fell by the wayside as unimportant or kind of forgotten about, well, as far as I'm concerned, we just kind of, dropped the purpose of the whole reason that there was ever, that this whole subject was ever brought up in the first place.
Yes.
And, a lot of people will say, well, I don't care about my doubts and questions. They're going on, and on all this stuff, and somehow then kind of assert, some kind of non-duality thing, like it's all that or it's all the oneness. I mean, the mind can get very, very sophisticated and kind of outsmarting itself by, kind of rationalizing all kinds of things. But
yeah.
It's something I would say, again, to kind of bring it back to something very basic, is do we know who we are? Is the nature of our identity clear? And, and in that seeing, have we exposed this conceptual bondage that's based on an erroneous understanding? And it's actually kind of very basic. It's not like it's kind of either that is clear, we have a sense of clarity on that, or it's not. And there's no purpose or there's no value in somehow skirting around that issue.
And it's really in the immediacy of this right now, because if we have this notion of a belief in some future enlightenment, then that puts it completely out of reach, doesn't it?
Yeah. So that's why, again, coming back to the basic, is that
already that.
Whatever I am, whatever the truth of what reality is basically by definition is here now, because it is what I am, and the question, or the real thing being kind of put out on the table is have a look, and do you understand what that is? So again, we're not dealing with something kind of esoteric or in the future. We're saying this doubtless being that I am, this presence or whatever we want to call that, this fact of myself that is already here. Mm-hmm. All we're doing really in all of these kind of pointers is we're just basically looking at that, and that's the hands-on part of this. So we start with that fact of our own presence, our own being, like right now, and say, well, what is it? What is the nature of this that I am? And that's actually the implementation of this. That's the application of it. And since that being, or since your own self is here and is already beyond doubt, it makes this thing tremendously available, like absolutely possible.
Yeah.
Because the answer, so to speak, or the subject which you're kind of looking at is already here and is already intuitively clear to yourself already.
I think I heard one guy put it as noticing what you already know.
Yeah, but we may have been looking away from that and paying more attention to the concepts of what the mind was telling me that I am. You're this, you're this, you're this. This is what you are. And, for a long time we may have been following that. And what you'll find is that conceptualizing or labeling of what you are has never been true. Nobody, and that's, if we look right now, what am I? One of the things that you can see is these thoughts and appearances that are just coming and going and arising and setting moment by moment. They're not what you are, because they don't even last long enough to really, stay around, because, the thoughts that you've had, 5 minutes ago have absolutely vanished without any trace, and yet here you are.
Mm-hmm.
So, as we start to really clarify what's being pointed to as our fundamental identity, we're going to start to see things very, very quickly like that. Like these things which I've been looking at and assuming to be who I am can't possibly be that. So that's why so I would say very simply, what you are is not a thought. I don't think anybody that's listening to this would ever really, if they really looked at that, say, well, what I am is a passing concept. Because, what concept have you ever had, that really stays with you for more than a second or two? And, we know intuitively that sense of being is not coming and going like some passing concept. And that's why when people say things like, the answer to this is not in the mind.
Well, meaning that it's not in any concepts, not in language.
It's not, yeah, because you're not, nobody is a word. We use words and stuff, but nobody would say, I am a word. Yeah. My actual presence here, my actual being itself is somehow a word. But until we've actually looked at that, we may have been under a little bit of confusion about that. We say, well, the mind says that I'm such and such of a person. But it turns out that that's not what you are at all. You're not some label or some concept or some image in the mind that's just floating through, you're aware of that. So, when you start looking that way, a lot of these assumptions, a lot of these ideas that we've taken as true, they just start crumbling away in the looking itself.
It's kind of like getting close enough to a mirage, you see that there's no water there.
That's right. And, and so in a certain sort of a way, we've been living under a kind of a hallucination to some mirage that we've taken as true. Now, if you want to see through that and step beyond that, you kind of go up to it and you investigate it. And in that looking, the reality of that dissolves. Mm-hmm. And that's why it is important that we talk about these things and we examine these things and we do the investigation.
And then there's the question might come up, well, where did the water in the mirage go? No, the water was never there.
That's right. Yeah. So, that's why, when we look like this notion that I'm a separate person, for example, which we know now in talking about this is the conceptual root of the kind of mirage of the suffering experience. Now, a lot of the sages and teachers have very directly encouraged the investigation of the reality of that separate person. They've said, actually look at it and see what you can find. In other words, explore it. Go up to that mirage and see what you can see and see if it's true. Can you find that separate I, for example? Or, let's say that you have this idea that I'm not enlightened or I'm not good enough or there's something wrong with me. Often you'd hear people saying things like, have a look at that me, or trace the reality of that I who's not enlightened and see what you can see. Because what they're telling us is that this notion that I'm not enlightened is a label or a description about, the assumed presence or reality of that individual who has that quality, that I who is not enlightened. So normally what we're doing is we're not examining the root of it. We're just saying, look, I'm a guy who's not enlightened, and I want to get enlightened, and can somebody tell me what I need to do all that? And this non-duality is taking it at a completely different perspective. Mm-hmm. It's not responding to the labels and the judgments about the I, about that reference point. It's actually encouraging us to examine the reality of that reference point. So you'll hear things like, who has the doubt, or who is it that's in bondage? What do you see about that? And as you explore that, like, where is this unenlightened person? You actually look for that. It's like walking up to that mirage, where as you get close to it, the thing that you assumed was present vanishes, because with one voice, one common voice through all of these traditions, it's always been described that the root of the conceptual bondage, that the separate self, has never existed.
Never was a water in the mirage.
Yeah, and one teacher, I forget who it was, said something one time that was a kind of a nice statement of this. They said, the cause of suffering, they say suffering, meaning, all this limiting conceptualizing, that suffering has a cause. But when you look for the cause, you find the cause has never existed. It's a kind of a total mind bender, but it turns out to be exactly the experience of this. When you look to find what am I, and you examine that, it turns out to be that defective separate person standing outside of the deeper reality is completely non-existent. Why? Because you are that reality. Mm-hmm. And that reality is the truth, and that reality is the unconditioned. And that, when we look in direct experience, what this being, this positive being that's here right now, in no way, shape, or form will we find it to be, some limited separate self.
And not only that, we find that it doesn't even exist.
Yeah, that separate self, we can't find any proof or any experience at all, ever,
And this brings you back to that what you really are is no thing.
Yeah, what is this, what is this sense of being, And what you'll see is it's a doubtless clarity, it's a doubtless presence, and it's a doubtless, and it has a vivid, aware, awake knowingness about it. And yet when you look right at that, it's not a thing. It's not an object. It's not some appearance that you can grasp.
It's kind of like the light from a light bulb doesn't have any objective substance, but it is the light itself, and that's not an object, but it's self-luminous.
Yeah. So even in a relative way, we see things that are relatively non-objective, and yet they're very present. They're very functional. They're very useful. Light is not a thing like an object you can grasp with your hand. And neither is your existence. Neither is this reality that people talk about as your true nature. And just because, this is what often kind of baffles, the mind, or, when people first look at this, is we're always looking for something.
Yeah.
So somebody says, your true nature or reality or something like that, and then we basically think, okay, I'm going to go find that somewhere. But this turns out to be not a thing, not an object. And yet, on the other hand, it's a totally vivid, doubtless reality. So what we're actually talking about, when we talk about who we are, we're talking about a very real, totally doubtless presence that is completely non-objective. It's completely no thing. And people would say, well, what do I do with that, or how do I understand it? Doesn't they kind of like from a conceptual point of view, it's kind of it doesn't make sense. But still, here you are.
And how can a thought grasp no thing?
Yeah, and this turns out to be what they've been talking about since the beginning. This is exactly what non-duality is about. This is what Zen is about. This is what Tibetan Buddhism is about. It's what Vedanta and Advaita is about, and all of these things. Even
the Christian mystics had it too.
Yeah, I remember a quote that Meister Eckhart said. He said, "I'm always talking about that uncreated light in the center of the soul." So that's what I'm talking about. That's what all my sermons are about. And, that uncreated, unborn light of consciousness or awareness itself is what they've been telling us all along, is that's who you are. That's what you are. And, and that's the basis and substratum and container of all experiences, the world and the senses and the body and the mind, and the waking and the dreaming and sleeping and the knowledge and the lack of knowledge, and when I'm conscious, when I'm unconscious, whatever it could be that can be framed as some kind of experience, that still is an appearance in the presence of what I am. I'm prior to those things. And yet, on the other hand, I contain all of those things, and none of those are separate or apart from that either.
Yeah.
And so there's many ways that people point to that, and but we just have to take them as a kind of a pointer, and then make sure that we apply that pointer and make sure that we see it and understand for ourselves. Because we don't want to be an expert in non-duality, but have no idea who we are.
And miss the meal.
Yeah.
And wonder why life tastes like cardboard.
I would say all you need to do is take a handful of basic pointers, 2 or 3 basic points. Let them orient you to look at what you are, look at what's present for yourself, and get to the root of that, so that instead of living under a concept of what the mind tells me that I am, I'm living by a direct experience of what I know that I am, based on my own direct looking. And you cannot do that out of a book. Nobody can do that for you. It's not going to drop out of the clouds, as some kind of mystical thing. It's a very basic, practical, hands-on thing about, look at this, and you don't need much, you just need a couple of good, clear pointers.
Yeah.
But you do have to look for yourself,
So the application of them, as long as there's the sense of being an individual, then that sense of individuality has really got to be looked head on at, doesn't it?
Yeah. And I guess I would conclude on this that this statement, this kind of initial statement where somebody says there's nobody here to do that, and then they kind of stop like that.
Yeah.
All I would really want to stress with that is if the understanding actually is that there's nobody here, okay, then the game is over and you couldn't possibly have any question.
Right.
So just make sure that, that if we make an assertion like a non-dual pointer, like something that we've heard, and we say, well, there's nobody here to do that, like that's some kind of refutation or some kind of diminishment of the pointers or something like that. Just be clear on that, because that is not a refutation. That statement is a confirmation of what the pointers have been trying to say all along. And we don't want to end up with this booby prize,
right,
where I'm just proclaiming the pointers and yet somehow I'm not experiencing the fruit of that. And so if somebody comes to me and says, well, there's nobody there to do that, I'll say, okay, great, that's the understanding itself, full stop.
Now, where's any problem?
And if they say, yeah, but, okay, well, okay, then we got to go back to the basics and make sure that this isn't just some intellectual verbiage.
Right.
Because if you say that there's nobody here like that there cannot be any, a problem, because there's nobody to have a problem. So, it's very important to, I do see that quite a bit, as it's kind of more like asserting kind of the concept without the understanding. And I guess what I'm encouraging is drop the concept and make sure you have the understanding. So that's,
Because this understanding is non-conceptual.
Yeah, and you can't get out of it and try to keep going like, well, there's nobody here to have the understanding. So that's just looping on the same point.
Yeah, it's a kind of, well, it's back into the vicious circle of concept and experience, but never the direct seeing that the concepts and experiences and whatever's apparently causing the experience, which does have a cause, is this assumption that hasn't really been fully rooted out through the examination. Yes?
Yeah, and and I think that, if we look at where a lot of these types of teachings come from historically, most people that are reading about non-duality and stuff, they've heard it from somewhere, read it from somewhere, they picked up some pointer, and, where did these things come from? It came from people that looked at this, came from people that saw, that had gotten to the basics of this, had gotten to the root of it, and, had something immensely valuable to share. And we're encouraging others, based on what they saw, to have a look, for themselves. So, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and kind of dispense with the basic points, kind of like before they're appreciated for it.
Well, when you and I first met, you chastised me not to try to fly the airplane before it was built, right?
Yeah.
Very good advice.
Yeah, because, you kind of, at that time, wanted to have the understanding, wanted to get it or something like that. I want to be able to say that I as an individual, I can say that I have the understanding, like I'm there, and I think we see now that that's still kind of a concept for who? For,
some imaginary entity that's like
an individual that wants to have the understanding as a personal accomplishment.
Right.
And I can say, look at me, I understand. But See, we'll never really say that, when we look and see that this reference point is kind of a fiction. There'll just be the understanding with no one to have it. So because there is an understanding, there is a seeing through, there is an investigation, there is a resolution, but it's not anybody doing it, It's not any entity pulling it off somehow. It's like if I'm seeing right now, it's just seeing happening. It's not, it's not some miserable entity that's seeing.
Right.
So when there's an encouragement to investigate, it can be done without a sense of an entity. It's just the investigation happening based on intelligence. And, the concept being seen through by, not by an entity, but by the pure intelligence of that innate awareness itself. And we don't have to then say, well, who's doing that and blah, 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 because it's a wrong, formulation. It's never been done.
Well, you just kind of see all that as smoke and mirrors once seeing is authentic, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's just, a needless concept that is seen through, and that's it. And, it leaves not a person who is free, but it leaves freedom without a person.
Beautiful.
Without someone to be free. So I think we've about covered it. What do you think?
I think we covered the waterfront pretty good. Well, thank you, John. This has been fantastic, and I encourage everyone to visit John's website at www.thenaturalstate.org. And if you have any doubts or confusion left and you want to get them resolved, you can write to John. There's a way to write to him listed on his website, and you can request a one-to-one consultation, which is what I did, and I'm very glad I did. So that should do it for now, and thank you again, John. Appreciate it.
Thank you.